I didn't know I do all these things. Wonderful. So, I don't have a suit on, and I think that was great not to have a suit on today because otherwise it was a misfit. I was here 1 year ago, and basically I told the same. Yeah, because the interesting thing is that regulatory-wise, this is copy-paste. So 2019 is basically the same like 2020 because the regulator has given the industry another 1 year to get ready. The fact is that in all these countries, there is time until end of 2020 to get strong customer authentication right. Only again the British, they go a little bit longer, but overall the death date of strong customer authentication requirement within Europe is the 31st of December 2020. So basically not even 12 more months to go to get ready. Currently, we are in the situation that only around 60% of merchants have enrolled to the new protocol, which is called 3D Secure 2.0 or EMV 3D Secure. This sounds okay. Yeah, you could say 60%. I mean, there's almost a year more to go. 40%, this should be feasible. Unfortunately, there's only 1,000 of those overall sending really messages through the protocol. So basically almost no traffic is in the new protocol. There's only 20% of the card not present spend of these bins with the new protocol, which is very low. And this one should be read, in my opinion, too. I think the guys who've done this slide made a mistake in terms of coloring. The 30% of the 3D Secure challenges fail. So when a customer is really asked to put in a strong customer authentication, like an SMS, and afterwards a knowledge factor, or if he has to put his finger on his phone to identify himself, in 30% of the cases, the customer doesn't understand what he has to do. Yeah? Or it's failing because he's not registered to the system. And this is really dramatic because 30% failure means that in these occasions you have 70% conversion rate. And for all the merchants, conversion rate is a key factor because you want to have a conversion rate of 100%. If a customer decided to buy a product, you want that in 100% of the cases, this customer buys the product. And with this failure rate, not working. Yeah? So this is evil for the merchant. Same thing here, decline rate is very high, and overall we see that it's not really well working. Why is it not working? Why are we in this stage? We're in the stage because the industry hasn't adapted fast enough, and especially acquirers as well as PSPs are still in the process of adapting. And we have a couple of good examples where merchants have done a good job, but the majority of merchant PSPs and acquirers are still in the stage of building up the system. As well as that the issuers, issuers also are not ready. And this you can see when you are living in Germany or in some countries in Europe. Very often you haven't even heard about it, yeah? Because the bank hasn't addressed the subject to you, and therefore you're not aware, and therefore you don't know how to use it. Which leads us to the situation that since it is the way it is, that the strong customer authentication is not working in a way we want it to work, and this will possibly last for 2020, and hopefully we are better than in 2021, but still, situation is that strong customer authentication in very often times are not working. What we are focusing on is in the so-called exemptions, and the regulator has given the industry the possibility to not ask for strong customer authentication in occasions when certain of these situations arise. For example, everything which is below 30 euro can be exempted, but it has to be flagged in the future. So if you have a store, if you're a payment service provider, if you have interest in making business below 30 euro, go to your payment service provider and tell him, in the future, I want to flag these transactions. If you don't flag them correctly in the new protocol, then strong customer authentication will apply. And then your conversion rate will go down by 30%. So it's super important to have the flagging right. Or if you have very little fraud, you can say a strong customer authentication is not needed, but you have to flag it. If you cannot flag it, the bank will ask for strong customer authentication. Flagging is important, and flagging can only be done with the latest protocol. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about when I talk about flagging and exemptions, we believe that over 50% of all transactions in the e-commerce arena can be, if they are flagged correctly, done without a strong customer authentication. And if you remember what I just said in the beginning, that the strong customer authentication for some time, and possibly still in 2021, is not working properly. It is really important to have the flagging right to avoid strong customer authentication for at least the cases where the regulator has allowed to do so. And therefore, to do the flagging right, it is important to have the latest 3D secure protocol in place. So don't believe your payment service provider when he tells you it's absolutely sufficient to have 3D secure. No, it's not. It is only sufficient when your service provider is giving you 2.1 plus. This is what you have to ask your service provider for. The protocol 2.1 plus, because only with the plus you have all these exemptions. Yeah? It's a small, tiny thingy, yeah, but it's of utmost importance when you go in this direction. Otherwise, you will be stuck in the very high abandonment rate of 30%, and your conversion rate is going down. This is basically the key message I want to make today, that you ask your payment service providers, or that you look when you're a store, or if you have a plug-in and you ask with a plug-in to a payment service provider, that you get the latest EMV 3D Secure Transaction 2.1. Good. I have done my shot for the beginning, and now we see a real experience from Zalando on strong customer authentication.
Thanks, Carsten. Welcome. I want to walk you through how Zalando has implemented PSD2 in the last, I would say, 18 months. I think everybody knows Zalando as an e-commerce player. I think the important number here is on the one side that we operate our business in 17 countries. Most of them are under regulation of the EU, and that's why we have to implement PSD2 in all these countries. Second number that is interesting is that we have a deferred payment share of over 60%, most of them open invoice. So contrary to many other e-commerce players, we are in the lucky situation that most of our financial transactions are not in scope of PSD2. Still, given the overall revenue that we have, all the remaining 40% is of course a substantial amount of money, and we need to make sure that we can secure these revenues going forward. What is the impact of PSD2 for payments, for Zalando payments? So obviously, credit card, that's what everybody talks about, is now impacted by this new regulation. At Zalando, we have 3 different use cases around credit card payment. The most obvious, well-known one is this immediate payment. So in the checkout, you select your credit card payment and you pay immediately. We have in 3 countries also a deferred variant of credit card payment. So the customer just gives us their credit card data at time of checkout. But we give the customer, similar to the experience that you have with an open invoice, 18 days to try on the goods at home, and only then we charge what you have not yet returned in this time frame. And then we also have a loyalty program called Zalando Plus. And also there we have a recurring payment where we also allow credit card, and which is then also subject to PSD2. We can no longer process it in the way we did process it before. But it's not only credit card that is impacted by PSD2, right? Many other digital payment methods are also impacted. So PayPal, as a digital wallet, is subject to PSD2 as well. The only big difference is we cannot do anything about what PayPal does, right? They are basically the provider of this payment method. They basically decide how they implement PSD2 on their side. The same applies for the various online bank transfer services that exist in the different markets. Also there, it's primarily to the bank that these online bank transfer services support how they implement SCA, and we have no say on that. Still, we need to monitor what's going to happen there once basically there is a strong enforcement of these things, because many of these payment methods might see a hit in convenience at time of logging into those payment methods, making use of those payment methods. How did the implementation of 3DS look like on Zalando? So we first heard about what the impact actually might be already in 2017. Originally, we always thought PSD2 is just about open banking. This was a nice opportunity for us, but not a threat. But then we realized, okay, it might actually hit us. And then it was actually a Mastercard workshop beginning of 2018, which was for us also the kickoff for really start working on PSD2. And the actual implementation then started with the implementation of the 3DS protocol in early 2019. And it took us roughly 4 months to implement the protocol and then start an A/B test already with a small number of customers to see what the impact of this is. This was the basic implementation, but as I said, we have different use cases around credit card payment, and not all of them, the simple protocol implementation is sufficient. So for our recurring payments and for our deferred payments, we also had to implement the so-called merchant-initiated transactions, which is a different way that allows you to make credit card transactions without the customer being on site. You have to guide him once through the SCA, but then all subsequent transactions you can do without the customer being on site and being challenged. And this took us quite some while to implement it, first for new signups, but then also the so-called grandfathered MIT, which is necessary if you already have an existing subscription contract with a customer. Then you need to basically backlink all your subsequent transactions to the previous one that you had. Last but not least, short before September, when we realized that, okay, this SCA enforcement will not come in September, but it's completely unclear when and how the individual banks who are subject to enforcing SCA will actually start using it. And we saw that enforcing 3DS from the start is not a good idea because, as Carsten has said, we just lose too much business if we enforce it by ourselves. So that's why we said, okay, we need to implement a fallback logic that says, okay, we first try without, because most of the banks don't yet enforce it. But if this fails and they give us an indication that it fails because there was no strong customer authentication, then we retry again and send the customer into this flow. For those of you who also plan to implement it, just to give you a high-level idea what we had to implement, that's roughly how our architecture looks like. So we have a general payment processing engine. Then we have a specific engine just for credit card processing, which has 2 major components. One that did the 3DS1 protocol authentication, and another one that actually does then the credit card transactions. And since we host the credit card data in our own data centers, we are also subject to this PCI DSS security. And that's why we need dedicated environments where we highly secure the access to the raw credit card data. That's why there's always a connection. If you want to do something with credit cards, there's always the business logic that sits outside of the engine, but the actual protocol implementation towards the providers is then in this secure environment. For 3DS2, basically the implementation was then in 4 steps. First, we had to introduce these new components that are able to speak the 3DS2 protocol. Then we had to use the authentication that came out of this 3DS protocol in the authorizations. Then we had to implement the support of this new MIT framework in our credit card engine. And last but not least, we also had in the credit card engine to implement the fallback logic. So nothing that you do on a weekend. So it's quite some effort to transition over depending on how your solutions are set up. Many of you might have just a connection with a PSP that does most of this for you, but if you directly talk with acquirers and directly implement your credit card protocol yourself, be aware this is not a walk in the park to get this done. So let's quickly look in how now such a 3DS true transaction looks like. So on the left side, we see the customer in the checkout of Zalando. They decided to pay with credit card. Then there are different options how you could implement 3DS. We still do it with a redirect. So now there is a redirect to the bank, which then triggers in the customer's app of the bank the authentication flow, where the customer confirms that he wants to now really do this payment. And upon successful authentication, it goes back, the signal to the bank, and from then we get redirected back to the shop. So if everything's set up, it's not as convenient as before, but it's also not a killer, right? The challenge is getting this set up. Because, I mean, it took us quite some while to get a card that is enrolled for credit cards, to get all of this set up. And this is something that each and every of your customers will have to get through. So also this is something, think about how you can encourage your customers to sign up, talk with the major banks of your customers, what they do, because if the customers are not signed up before end of the year, you will lose business. So now I want to give you a little bit overview on the results of our A/B test. So we roughly have 1,000 customers that every day we send, that we force ourselves into the 3DS process. We only use this so far for the immediate payments, not for recurring payments. And the goal of this A/B test was really to get a reliable prediction of what PSD2 does to our business, because that's what we wanted to know. And once we know, we wanted to see what can we do about it to make the impact smaller. Let's look into the numbers. So this is the ultimate result. Let's look on the dotted line in the bottom. That's what we call 3DS ready transactions. So we're talking about today what we measure with our customer base. So it's always also important for you to understand what Carsten has presented is for the overall market. But your specific customers, they might be in a segment where things are different. So I would highly recommend to you to really look into what it does specifically for your business, because it might look different for your business than for the general market. What we see is we have never reached 20% of 3DS ready transactions. So 3DS ready could be, so if a transaction is not 3DS ready, this could mean either the bank has not yet implemented 3DS at all. This is these days rarely. So many banks, most banks have already implemented 3DS in some form, 3DS2. It could also mean that the customer is not yet enrolled. And that's the vast majority of customers out there. So most of the customers don't know yet how to authenticate a 3DS2 transactions. And then there are also many different things where the implementation of 3DS2 on the bank side is immature. So we have excluded those authentications that we get from the bank where we know later on we cannot authorize the payment. And I'll show you some numbers later on. So that's basically the reality of today. And that's why all the numbers that I present you are not covering what the market really does, what the impact of 3DS2 is. It just gives us a snapshot of what we can measure today. The second thing is the success rate. So success rate is defined as the percentage of customers that said, now I want to buy with my credit card, and then in the end successfully went through the whole flow, meaning through the authorization and later on the authentication and later the authorization. We have the dotted line on the bottom. This is basically the authorization rate the success rate that we currently see with the 3DS1 protocol, right? And this is, for us, again, for Zalando customers, between 40 and 50%. So we lose a fair percentage of our business once we send a customer into the existing 3DS1 flow. That's why we rarely do this. So only if our risk engine says, we are not sure about this customer, about this transaction, so we better validate that this is a valid consumer, then we go to 3DS1. The other dotted line on top is what we see without 3DS at all. This will no longer be possible, but there we are close to 90% success rates. And then we have this thick black bottom bar in the middle. This is basically the outcome of the customers that went through the 3DS2 flow. This actually does not look too bad because, I mean, it goes towards the 80% over time now. Initially, we had quite some ups and downs there, but now it stabilizes around 80%. But this is a false security signal because what you see in the red bar on top, this security, this 80% mostly comes from transactions where the bank has exempted SCA. What you see down here, this orange bar, this basically gives us the success rate for those transactions where the bank insisted on SCA. And based on the data that we see today, we believe that the exemptions that the issuers give us are premature, and in the future we'll get less of those exemptions. So the success rate, if banks don't change the systems, the success rate of a 3DS2 transaction would be substantially worse than what we see today. This is roughly where do we lose our customer, or where does the 3DS flow end? And so this chart starts only at 92%, right? So this means that we lose, the 3DS flow ends for most of the customer already in the first step, which we call device channel selection. So there we tell the bank, okay, is this a native mobile authorization or web authorization? And we give them the amount and whatever. This is basically just the initialization. But for most of the transactions, it already ends here. The second step of a 3DS2 transaction is device fingerprinting. So this is nothing where the customer is involved, but where the bank does some computation on the customer's device to fingerprint this device for fraud prevention. Also there, quite some percentage then ends, and only a small fraction right now, around about 2% actually gets into the SCA flow. That's what I said before, right? So if SCA gets enforced way more than these 2%, and the success rate of the SCA is so bad, then you will get hit with SCA. Let's jump a few of the details there. I think the most important thing there is in the device channel selection, where basically for most customers it ends, we see the vast majority, again it starts already with 60% here, the vast majority of transaction ends with we can't do 3DS2, you can only do 3DS1. And we know how bad 3DS1 is. Reason for that could be that the bank is not ready. Reason for that could be that the bank is ready, but the customer is not yet enrolled for 3DS2, and this is the vast majority. Or it could also be that our 3DS provider has seen, okay, when I do 3DS2 with this bank, the authorization data is so bad that I better ask you to do 3DS1 instead of 3DS2. And then the other reasons there is basically an attempted authentication. This is where the issuer has claimed, yes, we are ready, but actually they are not. Then the scheme jumps in and assumes that there is an authentication. And the unauthenticated cases, that's also a very interesting thing. These are all the customers that are neither enrolled for 3DS2 nor 3DS1. So this is the percentage of roughly 5%, 3 to 5% of customers that next year cannot do anything with the transactions, with their credit cards anymore. Let's And here, this is basically then the success rate of the challenge itself, right? So here we see, this is what I said before, we are around about between 40 and 50%, where once the customer gets into the flow, where they successfully come back. The others either don't come back at all, or where then the authentication actually fails because the customer could not successfully authenticate inside the application. Last chart on the authorization rate. So authentication is the new 3DS protocol. Authorization is then trying to actually make the transaction with this authenticated card. And there, that's what I told you before, what we see, depending on in which state we get an authentication from the issuer back, the quality of this authentication varies, right? So if we already get in the device channel selection step, an authentication token back, this has a far less chance to succeed than if we get an authentication after the strong customer authentication. And that's why I'm saying we cannot just rely on that we get an authentication token, because the quality of the authentication token, again, depends on when you got this. In summary, I think for us, one key takeaway is, with this little readiness of the whole industry, we cannot do any reliable prediction how this will impact our business early next year. But we see already it will have an impact, and you also saw that there was not so much movement in the last 3-4 months, that if there is not something speeding up very soon, then it will hit us substantially with credit cards business. Second, just getting the authentication through the new protocol does not imply that you also later on will get a successful authorization. And we should not hope that the banks will solve the SCA with the SCA in a way that is really convenient for our customers. And that's why everybody should think about any opportunity to make use for their business of exemptions or utilize MIT, because this, from my point of view, has a much higher chance to succeed than that next year all the customer problems with SCA will get resolved. Another aspect is you might want to evaluate so-called platform payment methods. So Apple Pay, Google Pay on the mobile device, because they have already the SCA solution solved in a very convenient way. So your credit card transactions through these platform payment methods are way more likely to succeed and provide a convenient checkout experience to your customers than when you rely on the SCA that comes from the individual banks. Then I think obviously with this low 3DS2 readiness, it is clear that this will be a moving target, and this will stay throughout the year and most likely also into next year. That's why I can also only recommend everybody to start implementing early and implement the fallback logic in your system, so that you don't get the negative impact already today, but that you're ready already today if some banks start enforcing SCA today, because from a law perspective, while they have a grace period, strictly to the law, they're still already obliged to enforce it. And last but not least, my recommendation to everybody: don't trust material, even don't trust my material, because what I can show you is only valid for Zalando. Build your solution yourself, measure what the impact is for you, and try to steer so that the business impact for your business is as small as possible. With that, I'm done.